Hello, I'm Heather Williams, Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues, affectionately known as PONY, here at CSIS. We've been getting a lot of questions over the past few weeks about nuclear testing. This presentation will cover what nuclear testing means, concerns about Russian and Chinese nuclear testing, and also the implications of a return to nuclear testing. So let's dive in. What kicked off all of these questions and all of these concerns about nuclear testing? It was a post from President Trump a few hours before his meeting with Xi Jinping on October 29th, in which he referred to nuclear competition between the United States, Russia, and China. And specifically, he pointed to this statement: "Because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately." But what did the president mean about testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis? What would this mean for nuclear stability and nuclear agreements like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or the testing moratorium, which has now been in place since the 1990s? The first thing that the president might have meant could have been a return to explosive nuclear testing. Just to allay any concerns up front, I don't think we're going to start seeing a return to mushroom clouds or this type of testing anytime soon. But since the first nuclear test in New Mexico in July 1945 through to the most recent test, which was by North Korea in 2017, there have been over 2,000 nuclear tests done by at least 8 countries. These tests were conducted both above ground, like the image that you're seeing here, and then they were moved underground as part of the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty. A return to explosive testing seems highly unlikely. Like I said, I don't think we're going to be seeing in mushroom clouds anytime soon. But these tests, they resulted in massive humanitarian and environmental consequences. For that reason, a return to this type of testing would just be incredibly politically challenging. Numerous members of Congress, including from Nevada, which is where the test site used to be, they have already come out in opposition to a return to explosive weapons testing. This type of testing also would not happen immediately, which is what the president suggested, because current U.S. test readiness would be in 36 months. So that's the first thing that the president might have been referring to, but it's probably not likely. Another thing that the president could have been referring to is what is called supercritical testing. And this is a nuclear experiment that will produce a self-sustaining chain reaction, but it's extremely low yield, so it would be really hard to detect, if not impossible. A 2020 State Department compliance report raised concerns that Russia might be conducting this type of test and said that Russia conducted experiments that were not consistent with the testing moratorium. And so you can see here what the report said exactly, which was some of its activities, being Russia, since 1996 have demonstrated a failure to adhere to the U.S. zero yield standard, which would prohibit supercritical tests. And so that supercritical option also seems might have been what the president was referring to. These concerns were raised in other compliance reports and by officials. So again, this seems like it might be what the president was referring to. To be clear, the U.S. does not conduct supercritical testing. What else could this have been referring to in terms post? It could be subcritical testing. These are experiments that do not produce a self-sustaining chain reaction. So supercritical testing does produce a self-sustaining chain reaction. Subcritical testing would not. These would be considered in compliance with a testing moratorium and the zero yield interpretation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And don't worry, I'll explain what zero yield means in a minute. But this image that you're seeing here, this is from a laser facility at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is part of an effort to simulate nuclear explosions, to collect data about the status of the nuclear weapons stockpile, to learn about how plutonium ages, to learn about weapons components. The U.S. has conducted 34 subcritical tests. Since the U.S. already conducts this type of experiments and subcritical testing, this probably isn't what the president was referring to. The final thing that Trump could have been talking about would be delivery systems. So not nuclear weapons themselves, but the vehicles that carry them. Trump's statement came shortly after Putin talked about some new novel systems that Russia had just tested, the Burevestnik and the Poseidon. Russia tested Burevestnik on October 21st, 2025, just a few days before the president's announcement. Burevestnik is a nuclear-powered cruise missile, which Putin claims has unlimited range. It can do really long loiter operations. Russia is also developing another pretty concerning type of weapon, the Poseidon, which is a nuclear-powered underwater drone. Following both of Russia's tests and President Putin's announcement, the U.S. also tested an ICBM Minuteman III, ICBM Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. So this also could have been what President Trump was referring to. It's not exactly a nuclear weapons test, but it's a nuclear delivery platform. In reality, this type of testing, it wouldn't be a big change from the status quo, since the U.S., like Russia, China, and many other countries, are frequently testing their weapons and missile systems. So that brings us to what Trump was referring to when he said that other countries were doing nuclear testing, in which he probably meant Russia and China's subcritical testing programs. That same 2020 State Department compliance report reported that some concerns about China's adherence to the zero-yield interpretation of the CTBT due to a lack of transparency. And you can see here that the concerns were that because the State Department couldn't completely confirm what China was up to due to this lack of transparency, there was a risk that it was operating against the zero yield standard. What zero yield means is that nuclear experiments cannot produce any self-sustaining chain reaction, and it prohibits weapons explosive testing. The U.S. was very explicit that when it interpreted and negotiated the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the testing moratorium, that this means zero yield. Russia and China, however, have used different, sometimes changing language and terms when they talk about the testing moratorium. Whereas the United States has conducted over 1,000 nuclear weapons explosive tests, Russia's conducted nearly as many. China has conducted less than 100 before it agreed to a testing moratorium in the 1990s. This means that the United States and Russia probably have more data about their nuclear arsenals and their weapons than China would have. Let's talk now about Russia and what Russia's been up to with regards to nuclear testing. Russia withdrew its ratification of the CTBT in 2023. That same year, Russia expanded its nuclear test facility at Novaya Zemlya, and a senior Russian official suggested that they should test at least one nuclear weapon. And we can see here what was some of the new activity going on at Novaya Zemlya, and here is that new facility that was mentioned in 2023. So why might Russia and China be doing low-yield tests? Supercritical tests, it could be cheaper. Russia and China might not care as much about environmental or humanitarian regulations. They could also be doing it to gain additional information about plutonium or other fissile material, about their existing weapons designs, weapons components, or what would be particularly concerning would be if they were using these tests to develop new weapons designs. Why this really matters, that 2020 compliance report also said any divergences in interpretation of the zero yield could have significant implications for U.S. national security if one or more nuclear weapon states were willing to conduct nuclear testing activities that other nuclear weapon states felt themselves to be precluded from taking. So basically, just to break that down, if Russia and China are conducting these supercritical tests, they could potentially be gaining some sort of an advantage, which the U.S. might miss out on depending on the status of the testing. Russia's actions themselves could lead to a nuclear weapons testing cascade, with China or any others then getting involved in testing again. So what we see here is the Nevada National Security Site, the former Nevada test site, and this is where the U.S. has been doing subcritical testing. Despite Russia and China's dubious compliance with a zero-yield interpretation of testing, the U.S. really shouldn't get back to nuclear testing, certainly not explosive testing, but even supercritical testing could come with some risks. Some of the big reasons for this. The first would be a testing cascade. If the United States does return to testing, Russia and China will probably see that as an excuse for them to expand any existing testing activities that they might be doing. But also, because China has the least amount of testing data, China probably would benefit the most from a return to nuclear testing. Another reason is that the U.S. has data from over 1,000 tests that can be analyzed further to gain a lot of the information that it needs. China just doesn't have that data, since the U.S. has completed so many more tests. Another reason that the U.S. shouldn't return to testing is that the U.S. really doesn't need to, and that's according to scientific, technical, and political leaders, many of whom have consistently said on the record that the U.S. doesn't need to test at this time in order to guarantee the safety, security, and reliability of the arsenal. Now, that might not be true in the future. Plutonium will age, the weapons will age. And so a return to testing at some point might be necessary, but right now that is not necessary for U.S. deterrence to stay safe, secure, and effective. The final reason why the U.S. really doesn't need to return to testing and shouldn't return to testing is that it would be a distraction from ongoing nuclear modernization programs. The national labs, the nuclear enterprise, like most of the industrial base, are really resource constrained right now. Workforce is a particular challenge. And in May of this year, the president released an executive order talking about the nuclear industrial base and how we need to revive the nuclear enterprise with a focus on workforce. A return to nuclear testing, whether that be explosive or supercritical, could divert those resources and really be a distraction. So where does this leave this, and what's the way ahead? The way ahead really needs to be to focus on Russian and Chinese non-compliance or potential non-compliance with the zero-yield test ban. What would this mean for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty? So this should be a call to the international community to investigate and get more information from Russia and China, focus on transparency and trust and confidence building measures to make sure that they are in compliance with the testing moratorium. And for the United States, it means to double down on modernization of the nuclear arsenal and investment in the nuclear enterprise and get on with that important work. So hopefully that answers a lot of the ongoing questions and provides some clarity about nuclear testing, and look forward to further conversations about this issue.